The Picts were the ancient people of Scotland, depicted by history as fearsome, painted warriors, feared even by the Romans.
The story of the Scottish Picts, those ferocious, tattooed warriors who held off the Roman Empire, has been trapped in legend. For well over 1,000 years, the only context we had painted them as mysterious, savage invaders from the Black Sea. Now, the final DNA reconstruction has ripped that narrative apart. The truth revealed by the Pictish genome is far stranger and more compelling than the ancient rumors. This wasn't a lost tribe drifting from far-off lands. The DNA proves their origins were local, their bloodline the bedrock of ancient Britain. But here's the catch. The most stunning paradox is where this ancient DNA is strongest today, and it's not where you think. Get ready to find out the biological bombshell that makes their disappearance a complete lie. The DNA that undid 1,000 years of myth. The Picts were the ancient people of Scotland, depicted by history as fearsome, painted warriors feared even by the Romans. Who were the Picts? Were they savage warriors from Eastern Europe as Roman writers claimed, or were they the original people of Scotland, a lost civilization? For the first time, we have the answer, and it comes directly from their DNA. A new study has cracked the Pictish genome. What they found doesn't just rewrite history, it presents a brand new puzzle that seems to defy all logic. We're going to show you exactly what this new science reveals about the Picts' true and baffling origins. For well over 1,000 years, the Picts have been Scotland's greatest historical puzzle. They were the original people of the North, a powerful and sophisticated group that dominated the lands north of modern-day England. These weren't just scattered tribes. The thing nobody tells you is that they were organized, powerful, and artistically brilliant. They formed kingdoms, built imposing fortifications, and were so militarily effective that they stopped the most powerful empire the world had ever known, the Roman army, dead in its tracks. The Romans are the ones who gave them their name. In the year 297 AD, a Roman writer first used the term Picti, which means the painted people or the tattooed people. It was a name born of fear and awe. Roman soldiers huddled behind their massive walls, first Hadrian's Wall, then the Antonine Wall, told stories of the fierce warriors from Caledonia, the lands to the north. These men would reportedly charge into battle with their bodies covered in intricate blue designs. For hundreds of years, the Picts were the ultimate other, the savage barbarians at the edge of the known world. Roman legions had conquered territory from the deserts of Syria to the forests of Germany, but they could not conquer northern Scotland. They built Hadrian's Wall, a massive 73-mile-long fortification, just to keep the northern tribes out. They even tried building another wall further north, the Antonine Wall, but they couldn't hold it. The Picts and their neighbors were too relentless. To the Romans, this was the absolute edge of civilization. But not all things are what they seem. When the Romans finally packed up and left Britain in the early 4th century, the Picts didn't just fade away, they exploded onto the scene. They established one of the most dominant kingdoms in early medieval Britain, a territory that stretched across huge parts of northern and eastern Scotland. And they left behind a legacy that has baffled experts ever since. They left no books, no histories, no letters. Instead, they left stone. All across the Scottish landscape, from the windswept islands of Orkney and Shetland down to the fertile plains of the east, they erected massive, beautifully carved monuments. These are the Pictish symbol stones, and they are, to put it mildly, one of archaeology's biggest mysteries. There are about 350 of these stones that have survived. They are covered in a symbolic language that even today nobody can fully decipher. The crazy part is, no one knows what these symbols mean. Elegant carvings of animals, wolves, stags, eagles, and salmon, rendered with a unique and sophisticated art style, nothing like the savage art you might expect. Then there's the bizarre, swimming elephant-like creature known only as the Pictish beast. Nobody knows what it is. Some have compared it to a seahorse or a dolphin. Others have even suggested it might be an early depiction of the Loch Ness Monster. The people who carved them seemed to vanish from history around the 9th century. Their culture and language disappearing as they merged with the Gaels to form the kingdom that would one day be called Scotland. Because they left no written records of their own, all we had were the legends. The most famous story came from a respected scholar named Bede, writing in the 8th century. He claimed the Picts were invaders from a land called Scythia, a vast territory near the Black Sea in Eastern Europe. The legend said they drifted by sea, missed Ireland, and landed in Scotland. Others claimed they came from Thrace in the Balkans. For centuries, this was the accepted story. The Picts were outsiders. Until now, there was no way to know. That is, until scientists turned to the one thing that never lies: DNA. The plan was to finally use cutting-edge genetic science to solve the mystery. The central question was simple: if the Picts weren't local, where did they come from? To answer that, scientists needed something that could survive 2,000 years of acidic Scottish soil: human remains. This was no easy task. Ancient remains from the Pictish period are incredibly rare. An international team of researchers focused on 2 key Pictish cemeteries, Port Mahomet further north and Rhynie in the south. The team, working in specialized clean rooms because ancient DNA is incredibly fragile, managed to extract ancient DNA from 8 different individuals. This was the key. For the first time, they weren't guessing based on stones or Roman rumors. They had the actual biological source code of the Picts. They had the hard data. The team then compared these ancient Pictish genomes against a massive database of more than 8,300 other genomes, both ancient and modern. The DNA evidence delivered a crushing blow to every single one of the exotic origin myths. The idea that the Picts came from Scythia? Completely wrong. 0 genetic evidence. The romantic tales of them being mysterious invaders from distant lands? All fiction. The truth, as revealed by the DNA, was something far more profound. The Picts were not mysterious immigrants at all. They were local. Their genes proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that they were descended from the local Iron Age populations who had lived in Britain for generations before the Romans ever set foot on the island. This was a wow factor moment for archaeology. It fundamentally changed the understanding of who the Picts were. They weren't invaders, they were the indigenous people of the land. Their unique culture, their bizarre art, their powerful kingdoms, it was all homegrown. But just as this revelation was sinking in, the scientists looked closer at the data. And that's when they found something else, something that made no sense at all. They had solved the mystery of where the Picts came from, only to find a new, even crazier paradox. Yet a closer look at the local roots would lead to a baffling geographic question: the shocking truth about who is most related to the Picts. This is the part of the discovery that truly defies all logic. The team had the Pictish DNA. They knew the Picts were local. The next logical step was to see who living today is most related to them. The answer everyone assumed would be simple. You see, the Pictish heartland, their Pictland, was famously in the east and north of Scotland. This is where their kingdoms were. This is where the vast majority of their symbol stones are found. Logically, modern people living in the east and north of Scotland should be the Picts' closest living relatives. It's just common sense. You find ancient bones in a place, you expect their descendants to be living right there, keeping that genetic signal strong. But here's the catch. The DNA results spat out an answer that was the exact opposite. The analysis, which looked for long stretches of shared DNA, found that the ancient Picts were not most closely related to modern people in eastern Scotland. It wasn't even close. Instead, the Pictish genome showed their closest genetic matches to modern people living in western Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Northumbria in the north of England. Let that sink in. The DNA of the Pictish nobility buried in the heart of their eastern kingdom is strongest today in the west, the very place where their main rivals, the Gaels of Dal Riata, lived. It makes absolutely no sense, but it's real data. And get this, the genetic similarity between the ancient Picts and modern people in the west of Scotland is incredibly high, suggesting a direct and largely unbroken lineage. This is a wow factor that changes the map of ancient Britain. How could this be? What most people don't realize is that history is not just about who lived in a place first, it's about who came after and how they mixed in. The researchers realized this paradox wasn't a flaw in the data. It was the data telling them a new, complex story of migration and mixing. The mystery of the missing Pictish DNA in the East is in fact the answer to what happened to them. So what happened in the East? Two words: new arrivals. First, beginning in the 5th century, the Anglo-Saxons began migrating into Britain from mainland Europe, places like modern-day Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark. They pushed west, and their genetic signature became incredibly strong in southern and, crucially, eastern England. This genetic wave didn't just stop at the modern border. It pushed right up into what would become southeastern Scotland. This new wave of people began to mix with and replace the older genetic code in that region. The sheer volume of this migration over hundreds of years meant the original Pictish signal was significantly diluted in the southeast. This is the first major blow to the pure Pictish lineage in their ancient heartland. But the real kicker came from the north. The Vikings. Starting in the late 8th century, the Vikings, mostly from Norway, began their famous raids. But they didn't just raid and leave, they stayed. They colonized and settled vast areas of northern and eastern Scotland. The islands of Orkney and Shetland, which were Pictish territories, were completely taken over. They became, for all intents and purposes, Norwegian colonies for hundreds of years. This Viking settlement was heavy all along the eastern coast, the exact heartland of the Picts. They brought their own Norwegian DNA, their language and their culture mixing with the local Pictish population so thoroughly that in many places, the Pictish genetic signal was heavily diluted. For example, some studies suggest that in areas like Shetland, the modern population has up to 25% Norwegian ancestry. That's a massive genetic influx that simply wasn't present in the West. So you have this pincers movement of new DNA. Anglo-Saxons moving up from the southeast and Vikings pouring in from the northeast, both right into the Pictish heartland. The result? The original Pictish genetic identity in the east was severely altered. Meanwhile, what was happening in the west? That area was more isolated from these specific migrations. The people there, along with the populations in Wales and Northern Ireland, were relatively more sheltered. They became a kind of genetic refuge, preserving an older, pre-Anglo-Saxon, pre-Viking genetic signature. The logic-defying discovery is that the Picts are the ancient Britons. Their DNA is the same as the ancient people of Wales and Northern Ireland. The reason their DNA is strongest in the west of Scotland today isn't because the Picts moved there. It's because the West remained genetically similar to what all of northern Britain used to look like before new groups arrived and changed the genetic landscape of the Pictish East. The Picts didn't vanish. The people in the East just got new neighbors who mixed in while the people in the West didn't. This was a revolutionary way to understand the genetic map of Scotland. It tells us that what we think of as modern Scottish ancestry is a complex mosaic. In the East, it's a mix of ancient British, Anglo-Saxon, and Norse. In the West, it's a much purer strain of the ancient British, or what we now know to be the true Pictish lineage. This discovery means that the people living in the Western Isles, the Hebrides, and in deep Welsh valleys are, genetically speaking, closer to the painted warriors who fought the Romans than the folks living near the famous Pictish symbol stones on the eastern coast. That's a huge, unexpected twist. The study also delved into the specific haplogroups, the genetic markers passed down exclusively through the male Y chromosome and the female mitochondrial DNA. In the male lineage, the Picts show a strong presence of the R1b haplogroup, which is common across Western Europe, especially in the areas of the ancient Britons. This further solidifies the local indigenous origin and links them directly to the modern-day Welsh and Irish populations. This isn't a Black Sea lineage, it's a homegrown European one. The sheer statistical weight of the data is a true wow factor. The study utilized sophisticated analytical tools comparing the ancient Pictish DNA with the genomes of 24 modern populations across the United Kingdom and Ireland. The statistical measure of shared ancestry consistently showed the strongest affinity between the Pictish samples and the Western British populations. For example, when comparing the Pictish genome to modern populations, the Western Scots, the Welsh, and the Northern Irish consistently ranked as the closest matches, showing a stronger genetic link than the populations in the Pictish Eastern Heartland itself. The implications of this geographic paradox are massive for Scottish history. It suggests that the formation of Scotland, far from being a simple, unified process, was a story of differential genetic survival. The people in the West, the Gaels, often seen as the founders of Scotland, were actually carrying a genetic code that was nearly identical to their eastern rivals. The so-called conquest of the Picts by the Gaels was, in genetic terms, more like an internal family reorganization in a relatively isolated corner of the British Isles. And get this, the very survival of the indigenous British language in the West, in the form of Welsh and Cornish, may be mirrored in how the Pictish language, a close relative of these British Celtic tongues, faded. It's highly probable that the Pictish language faded because the Gaelic language of the unifying Kingdom of Alba was seen as more useful for the powerful church and the new royal court. It wasn't a language replacement due to genocide, but a language replacement due to political convenience that happened right where the biggest waves of outside DNA were washing ashore. The West, being geographically sheltered, retained not only the ancient DNA, but also older cultural patterns. So the next time someone talks about the mysterious Picts, you can tell them the most important thing to know is this: they weren't aliens. They were the original people. The twist is that their biggest challenge wasn't the Romans, but the sheer volume of new immigrants that settled the East centuries later. This new wave of population influx essentially washed away the ancient Pictish signature from their own home, leaving its purest form preserved among their cousins in the quiet western corners of the island. This discovery would unravel a core historical assumption about Pictish royal power: the political secret, hidden in the king lists. For centuries, one of the most bizarre and famous facts about the Picts was their system of inheritance. Historians, starting with the famous Anglo-Saxon scholar Bede in the year 731 AD, believed the Picts were matrilineal. Bede was one of the most respected scholars of his age. His writings were, for many, the final word on history, and he wrote that if there was ever a dispute over the Pictish throne, they would choose a king from the female royal line rather than the male. This was an idea that historians have been crazy about for generations. Matrilineal succession is a very rare system where power and inheritance are passed down, not from father to son, but through the female line. In this theory, a Pictish king wouldn't be succeeded by his own son, but by his brother or his nephew, specifically his sister's son. This concept was reinforced by looking at the Pictish king lists. These are a series of ancient documents that list the names of the Pictish kings. When scholars tried to trace the names, they found that fathers and sons rarely followed each other. The names of the fathers of kings often seemed to be, well, not Pictish. They looked like names from Gaelic or Welsh kingdoms. This led to a whole romantic theory. People imagined a society where women held the power of lineage. Perhaps they theorized the Picts practiced matrilicality, where women stayed in their home villages their whole lives and their husbands had to move in with them. It was an exotic, fascinating idea that made the Picts seem even more mysterious and different from all their neighbors. And get this, the idea was so compelling that it was a core part of the Pictish legend for over 1,000 years. But here's the thing, was it true? The DNA study finally gave scientists a way to test this. The key was the cemetery at Port Mahomet. The team had mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, from 7 different individuals buried there. Remember, mtDNA is special. It is passed down only from a mother to her children. It's a perfect, unbroken maternal line. So if the Picts practiced matrilocality, if women stayed in their birth communities and were buried with their maternal relatives, the scientists would expect to find a lot of shared mitochondrial DNA. They would expect to see mothers, daughters, aunts, and cousins all buried together, all sharing the same maternal lineages. They would find genetic clusters showing that the women in this town were all related to each other. When the results from the 7 samples came back, they showed the exact opposite. All 7 individuals tested had unique mitochondrial DNA mutations. This means none of them were closely related on their mother's side. The genetic diversity in this one cemetery was incredibly high. To put it mildly, this finding is a complete bombshell for the matrilineal theory. The genetic evidence does not support a matrilineal system at all. In fact, it suggests the opposite. The diversity of female lineages means that women were moving into this community, not staying put. This practice is called female exogamy, women marrying outside their social groups and moving to live with their husbands. This is a far more common system around the world, and it's what the DNA strongly points to. So why did the king list look so weird? The thing nobody tells you is that matrilineal descent through women is not the same as kings marrying foreign princesses. The Pictish kings were likely just normal kings being succeeded by their sons or brothers. But they were also making smart political moves. They were marrying the daughters of kings from neighboring kingdoms, the Gaels, the Welsh, the Angles, to form powerful alliances. The foreign names on the king lists weren't the kings. They were the fathers of the king's wives. The Picts weren't a strange matriarchal society. They were a normal, politically savvy kingdom. And the old theory was just a misunderstanding of confusing records written by outsiders like Bede. This is a massive wow factor for history. The 1,000-year-old belief in Pictish matrilineal power is simply not supported by the biological data. This new understanding changes the entire narrative of their vanishing. The disappearance of the Picts around the 9th century is one of the most abrupt and baffling silences in all of history. An entire kingdom that had existed for over 600 years, a people who had held back the Roman Empire, just stopped being written about. Their language, a tongue that is now utterly lost, faded from the hills. Their unique and mesmerizing symbols stopped being carved. Their very name, Picti, was lost to the winds and replaced by a new one, the Scots. The man at the very center of this story, the prime suspect in their disappearance, is Kenneth MacAlpin. History tells us that around the year 843 AD, he, a king of the Gaels, also became the king of the Picts. The two kingdoms, rivals for centuries, were suddenly united into a new kingdom called Alba, the Gaelic word for the land. Alba would in time become the foundation of modern Scotland. But how did this union happen? This is where the dark stories begin. Was it a violent conquest? Did the Gaels invade and wipe out the Pictish nobility? This was one very popular theory. It's simple, it's brutal, and it explains the silence. There is even a dark, dramatic legend known as the Treason of Scone that describes exactly how it might have happened. The story goes that Kenneth MacAlpin, cementing his new power, invited the 7 Earls of Pictland, the great regional lords and the most powerful Pictish nobles, to a great feast at Scone. He came to discuss the future of the two kingdoms, to make peace. But as the story goes, the Gaels had set a trap. They had rigged the benches where the Pictish lords sat. At a given signal, the bolts were drawn. The benches collapsed, dropping the unsuspecting Picts into pits dug beneath the floorboards. There, hidden and waiting, were armed Gaelic warriors who ended the Pictish aristocracy in a single night of treachery. It's a cinematic story of betrayal. It answers the question of the vanishing perfectly. In one fell swoop, the Picts were decapitated. Their leaders were gone, their power structure was shattered, and their kingdom was ripe for the taking. But is it true? What many historians overlooked is that this grisly story was written down hundreds of years after it supposedly happened, likely by writers who wanted to legitimize the new Gaelic dynasty. It felt too neat. And here's the biggest flaw, a biological one: the DNA evidence. The DNA proves unequivocally that the Picts and the Gaels were already genetically almost identical. They were both part of that same ancient British genetic stock that had been in the British Isles since the Iron Age. The Gaels, who came from Northern Ireland, were not a different race. They were simply cousins who had crossed the narrow sea, themselves descendants of the same ancient population. The DNA shows there was no massive population replacement. There was no great vanishing. The genetic landscape of Scotland did not change in the 9th century. This finding makes the Treason of Scone not just a dark fairy tale, but a biological impossibility. You cannot replace a people who are genetically indistinguishable from you. What happened was a cultural shift. It was a political and linguistic takeover, not a genetic one. The two groups, Picts and Gaels, merged, but as so often happens in history, one culture became dominant. In this case, it was the Gaelic culture. Why did the Gaelic culture win out? The reasons were practical, not supernatural. The Vikings were raiding everyone, shattering the old power structures. Kenneth MacAlpin was likely a brilliant political operator, perhaps a great wartime leader who forged alliances. He may well have had a Pictish mother, as intermarriage at the noble level was common for centuries. This wasn't an invasion. It was the final act of a long-running family merger, and one side of the family got the naming rights. The Gaelic language spread. It became the language of the new unified court. Crucially, it was the language of the powerful and prestigious church based on the Gaelic island of Iona. To get ahead, to get a position of power, to speak to the abbots and the king, you spoke Gaelic. The Pictish language, which was likely a Celtic language related to Welsh, slowly faded away. It was probably seen as old-fashioned, the language of the grandparents, the language of the Old Kingdom. Within a few generations, people who were 100% genetically Pictish simply began to call themselves Scots. They adopted the new language and the new unified identity. So, the DNA proves the Picts were the local heart of ancient Britain and that the idea of a vanishing was a myth. They became the Scots. What unique cultural traits do you think the Picts contributed to modern Scottish identity? Like and subscribe for more deep dives into the truth behind history's greatest mysteries.